Thank you for joining us for this evening's Artist and Inspiration program. I'm Cheryl Bronstein, Director of Interpretation at the Adirondack Experience, and I would like to start this evening's program by acknowledging that the Adirondack Experience is situated on the Aboriginal territories of the Mohawk and Abenaki communities. Indigenous people continue to live in this region and practice their teachings and life ways. In less than 3 months, it is coming so close. The museum will open our newest permanent exhibition, Artists and Inspiration in the Wild. Will be opening on July 1st. You can check for construction and project updates on our website and on our social media. And after more than 2 years, we will also be bringing this monthly speaker program focused on the exhibition to a close. But don't worry, we'll be introducing some new Zoom programs later this year. We hope you join us next month as we come from inside the exhibit itself. Tonight's program is all about the art that will be on view in July, the largest collection of Adirondack art ever on permanent exhibit. I am so pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Laura Rice, whose vision, dedication, and scholarship have given shape to what you will see. She is the mastermind behind this incredible exhibit. Laura received her master's in American Studies from the University of Pennsylvania. She has served as curator of prints and photographs at the Maryland Historical Society, curator of the Clymer Museum of Art, educator at the Kent Delord House, and has been with us at the Adirondack Experience since 2003, where she is currently the chief curator. Throughout this evening's presentation, please feel free to submit any questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll go ahead and take questions at the end of the program. All right, Laura, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. So I'm really excited about this project. As Cheryl just said, this is something that we've been working on for a long time now, and suddenly it's all coming together, and we're both excited and feeling a little, things are hectic and wonderful. And so rather than do a lecture or something with a more intellectual bent, I thought it might be kind of fun to give you all a sneak peek at what will be coming. And, this is our first opportunity to have a place permanently dedicated to all of the materials related to Adirondack art and design. So it is, as Cheryl said, a permanent exhibition, but that does not mean static. Things will be changing on an almost yearly basis. You'll get to see new things moving forward. So come and join us in July when it opens, and then please come back again. I promise you will be seeing new things. So tonight I will share with you some things that you'll see this year, and 1 or 2 things that will be included in the exhibit in years to come. When we started thinking about this project, which seems like a long time ago, we recognized that the Adirondack Park is a very special place. It's what a scholar would call a deeply felt place. There's something here that people find when they come, that deep connection to the natural world, where you feel at home, where you're surrounded by this aesthetic experience, this tremendous natural beauty. It's a sensory experience, the smell of the balsam, the light reflecting off the water, all of those things help create a really strong sense of place for most of us. And that's true also for artists who come and work in the Adirondacks. Their work, their creative output also reflects and reinforces that sense of place for us. So art here is both deeply personal for each artist and broadly defining, reflecting and reinforcing in the art and iconic design of the region that great sense of place that we all have. So this exhibit will really address the inseparable connection between Adirondack art and design and the natural environment. And what's wonderful is that you can see this over a wide swath of time by a wide variety of artists working in an incredible variety of medium. So things that on the surface might not look connected in any way, in fact are. And we hope that you will see that as you go through this exhibition. So Cheryl, if you want to bring up the slideshow for us and go to the first slide. So I thought it was appropriate for this evening to start with an artist who's really sort of iconic in the history of Adirondack art. This is by Arthur Fitzwilliam Tait, who is perhaps the quintessential Adirondack artist. This is one of his largest paintings called Still Hunting on the First Snow, a Second Shot. He painted this in 1855. The man on the left in red is Matthew Brady, the famous Civil War photographer. The man on the right in brown buckskin is Tait himself taking a second shot, which seems unlikely if you know Adirondack deer. But it's one of the more important works, and Tait is an important artist for the Adirondack region because he was a prolific artist. He produced lots of paintings of the Adirondacks, many of which, including this one, were converted into lithographic prints, which could be published and printed for a much lower cost and purchased by people who could not afford the original artwork. But he had a mass distribution of his images, and much of what he painted reflected his image of the Adirondacks as a sportsman's paradise, a very masculine space, a place where men could come together as brothers and do manly things, hunt, fish, camp, test their mettle against the wild. So this is called Still Hunting. Still hunting is what one hunter has called a perfected sneak. In other words, during the 19th century, it was common to use dogs in hunting, and they would chase the deer toward the hunters to make it easier for the hunters to take a shot. Still hunting is something you do without that sort of assistance, and you rely on your own wiles to sneak up on your prey. Which is what Brady and Tait have done here. Tait's kind of an interesting guy. He was an English immigrant, came over to the United States in 1850, came to the Adirondacks to check up on a family member, and ended up falling in love with the place. And so you see that in his artwork over and over again. Next slide, please. So by contrast, here we have a much more contemporary image of hunting in the Adirondacks. This one too is a very large canvas. The figure that you see is almost life-size. This is called A Hunter in the Snow, Orion, from 1975 by Donald James Wynne. This is his portrait of his friend Richard Cedric Gates hunting in the Adirondacks on a sunny winter day in his Malone wool hunting jacket. And what's very different about this perception of hunters in the Adirondacks is that it's much more relaxed. Cedric Gates is not trying to conquer nature. He's not exuding that sort of masculine energy and action that Tait liked to portray in his images. Cedric Gates is really part of his environment. He's very comfortable in his surroundings. He's part of this place. And as the artist wrote about this painting, he says, as part of my attempt to capture the spirit of the Adirondacks, I painted Blue Mountain Lake native Richard Cedric Gates, having in mind the mythical hunter Orion, setting the time of year as deer season. In the museum's Woods and Waters exhibit is the companion piece, my campfire Artemis painting, with a constellation Orion shining in the night sky. If you could go to the next slide. Orion and Artemis, legendary hunters of Greek mythology set in the contemporary Adirondacks. So they're really companion pieces. And so this year in July, you can see Cedric Gates hanging in Artist and Inspiration in the Wild, And you can also see the companion piece, Campfire Artemis, hanging in Woods and Waters gallery. Next slide, please. So an ongoing theme when you start looking at landscape images of the Adirondacks is how people understood human relationship to nature and what that was like in this particular place. And an ongoing myth that began centuries ago, which unfortunately lingers even in today, is that the indigenous peoples who lived in this region, who lived in the Adirondacks, were believed to have vanished during the 19th century, that they went away, that they were never really here, they didn't really live in the Adirondacks. A total misconception, but you see it repeated not just in writing, but also visually. And here you have a view of Indian paths from Lake Henderson from 1838 by John Henry Bufford. This is a hand-colored lithograph. So an image that would have had a fairly wide distribution, published in books, published as single sheets. And you have a weeping Indian by the shore of Lake Henderson, grieving the inevitable loss of his tribal homelands to white newcomers. That in fact, in 1838, both Mohawk and Abenaki Nation were living and thriving in the Adirondacks, as they still do. Can you go to the next slide, please? So there's actually a very vibrant artistic community, particularly in the Mohawk Nation, and a lot of artists within that community, one of whom is Dave Fadden, expresses through their art the fact that they are here, they are present, they are not people belonging to the past, but are a vital part of the Adirondack community today. This is called He Peers Through the Trees, as I said, by Dave Fadden, a fairly recent acquisition to the museum collections. And I'll read you what he has to say about this painting. He Peers Through the Trees was the name given to his grandfather. The notion is when one is in a thick forest and looks beyond the trees, the gaze peers between the trunks of the trees, leaves, and foliage. This name was truly fitting for my grandfather. Many times I hiked with him in the woods surrounding our homes in Onchayota, and he always knew his way despite never following a marked trail. I was truly impressed. This painting is reflective of his name with the gaze of the First Nations man looking straight at the viewer. And one of the things that I really love about Dave Fadden, about the portraits that he does, is that he really expresses the humanity of the people he portrays. These are not stereotypes, they're not caricatures, they are truly portraits, and you see the personality shining through. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we've also been doing is taking a very close look at who is represented in the art collection. And when we begin to look at the 19th century, it was apparent to us that women artists were few and far between, which isn't terribly surprising. Women in the second half of the 19th century certainly were allowed, sometimes even encouraged, to attend prestigious art schools alongside male counterparts. They were held to the same academic standards, the same high standards that their male counterparts were held to. They even were permitted and encouraged to exhibit at places like the National Academy of Design or the Brooklyn Art Association alongside their male counterparts. But they were women, and they were generally regarded as hobbyists rather than as serious artists. So it's very difficult for women, no matter their talent, to really make a career of art. They were expected to get married, have children, take care of the home. But we have in our collection a woman painter who bucked the trend and who chose an art career over societal expectations. And this is one of her pieces. This is Whiteface Mountain from Mirror Lake in 1894 by Catherine or Kate Newhall. Kate Newhall earned a certificate in drawing and painting from Cooper Union when she was in her 20s. She exhibited at the National Academy of Design and other prestigious associations, and made several trips into the Adirondacks in the 1870s and 1890s. So this is probably the result of one of her last trips into the Adirondacks. She moved to California in 1897, settled in Berkeley, and became quite active in the art scene there. And this painting, which I think is quite charming, she made as a wedding present for two close friends who were getting married in 1894. But you see this again, this close attention to light and atmosphere, reflections off the water. If you go to the next slide, which you can also see here. So 130 years later, we can say that women are definitely taken seriously as artists, although their pay scale still lags a bit behind their male counterparts. But this is a painting that we just acquired called Shadows and Snow, done in 2021 by Tait Walter. Tait lives in the Saratoga area and paints quite a bit in the Adirondack Mountains, and I'm pleased to say makes a living as a working artist and as an art teacher. So she wrote a bit about this painting for us, and she said that it captures a cross-country trail at Great Camp Santanoni in Newcomb, New York. This painting is inspired by memories of my first cross-country ski trip to the preserve in January 2020. The 10-mile excursion was both exhilarating and challenging. It was incredible to experience the 13,000-acre property on a sunny winter day. As an artist, I'm captivated by light, and I was struck by the patterns and shadows made in the snow overlapping with the ski tracks. So a really beautiful example of her work. Next slide, please. So another artist who also was captivated by light and water, whether it was frozen or liquid, was photographer Seneca Ray Stoddard. This is one of my favorites that he made. So this is Lake George, Sheldon's Point from Trout Pavilion from about 1890. And what's kind of interesting about Stoddard, or one of the many interesting things about Stoddard, is that he was a landscape painter before he turned to photography. And you can see that painterly element coming out in many of his photographs. And it's certainly evident in this one. It's a very carefully composed photograph. But again, he too is fascinated by light and the effect of light and water together. And here you have this wonderful, very atmospheric view of Lake George. Of all photographers who have worked in the Adirondacks, he is undoubtedly the most influential, active in the the second half of the 19th century. He is also one of the most important American landscape photographers, not just Adirondack, but his influence, of course, for those of you who are familiar with him, in shaping our perception of what this place is, of what the Adirondacks are, comes from his writing, guidebooks, the thousands of photographs he took and sold to tourists and residents alike. And here you see the Adirondacks really presented as a very serene, light-filled, almost spiritual place, a very comfortable place, a place you could bring children and women, not just an overtly masculine experience. This was something for everyone. Next slide, please. So this is a piece that we've also recently acquired. This is called Ripple from 2001. And artist Liz Alpert Faye also plays with the effects of light and water and how they come together to make specific kinds of images. But her medium is very different from Seneca Ray Stoddard. She is a textile artist. Nature is her primary source of inspiration. She says, the beauty and simplicity in nature continues to inspire me. Memories of places I've been and things I've seen spark my desire to record my thoughts and feelings in a visual way. And she does that with rug hooking, punch needle embroidery, hand applique. Really very talented and very oriented toward color. She uses a lot of wool and other materials that are recycled. Uses traditional methods of working fiber and other textiles. And this piece, which connects it so well to Stoddard's work, this piece, she says, was inspired by the many times I've sat looking at the water at dusk when day transitions to evening on Blue Mountain Lake. And of course, if you've ever sat by a lake and watched the sun go down, you know that the colors change and ripple across the surface of the water, which I think she's just captured beautifully. So this is one of those pieces that we actually acquired, I think just earlier or late last year, early this year. This will be going into the exhibit a little bit later. So you'll have to come back maybe next year to see this piece. Next slide, please. So in thinking about all the different ways that people express themselves creatively in the Adirondacks, it's important to remember the written word to a certain extent. This is from our library collections. It is a handwritten manuscript, beautifully bound in leather and gilt. It is called an Adirondack Sporting Tour. Go to next slide. This is from 1870. It was written and illustrated by a young man named John Struthers. During, beginning about the 1850s and onward, it was not unusual for wealthy young men to take a break from schooling. Maybe they're just getting out of school before they really begin their career in a serious way. They would spend several weeks in the Adirondacks on a hunting, camping, and fishing trip, which is what John Struthers did with two of his friends, who you can see here on the frontispiece. What's really unique about this, I mean, there were many travel journals written, accounts of coming into the Adirondacks, what it was like to bushwhack up a mountain, descriptions of the guides they would hire, the activities they did. This one is written in a very humorous fashion, all about the adventures and misadventures of these three young men. And what's unique about it is the illustration work, which you can see a little bit at the bottom. You've got two little figures resting in the little curlicues. You've got the caricatures of the young men topped with actual photographic portraits. And if you go to the next slide, the rest of it is illustrated like an illuminated manuscript from medieval times. It's really beautiful. Different colored inks, gold leaf, all the way through. And it's a fairly lengthy tome for a handwritten manuscript. John Struthers was the heir to a marble cutting business in Philadelphia. And this was a firm that was responsible for building the facades of a lot of municipal buildings, for carving gravestones, tombs, and that sort of thing. So draftsmanship would have been a very important skill for John Struthers, and he certainly demonstrates throughout this book that he had definitely developed that skill. But all of this, again, is inspired by his time in the Adirondacks, what it was like to be out in the woods, away from everything that was familiar. So these kinds of written accounts are actually quite important. Visually, they're very lively, but also the written word really brings to life what all of this was like during his time. If you go to the next slide, please. So this is a tradition that continues. There are still people who will write and keep journals and talk about their experiences in the Adirondacks. This is one from about 1960, put together by a man named Seth Moulton. And unlike John Struthers, he did not come from a wealthy or educated background. He was a dairy farmer who taught himself to paint very late in life. He developed some poor health and was forced to retire in 1947. And to occupy his time, he began sketching and drawing, and because he was on a limited income, would use whatever materials he had around the house. So house paint, ballpoint pen, he would carve his own paintbrush handles, use horsehair and even his grandchildren's hair to make paintbrushes. But one of the things that we have in the museum's library collection is this wonderful scrapbook that he put together. And you can see that he's made some sketches on what look like those pieces of cardboard that would reinforce packages of women's stockings back in the 60s and 70s. He was not a good speller, so a lot of what he wrote was done phonetically. Didn't really know how to use punctuation, but he wrote running commentaries about what he was drawing, and it's this really vivid image of his life. And just to give you some sense of what he was like and what his personnel was like, he was expelled from school at the age of 15 because he hit the principal. As he wrote, he said, he was going to whip me. He was big. So I knocked him down with a big dictionary, went up the road 5 miles, got a job driving team drawing logs in the lumber woods. That's the last schooling I got, 3 months in the 4th grade. So in spite of his limited education, he in fact became a historian, and he gives us a really wonderful window into what his life was like and what life was like in his immediate neighborhood. If you can go to the next slide, please. This is probably one of the more iconic objects in our collection. We have, we think, the largest collection of Adirondack rustic furniture in the country, and this is one of the outstanding pieces from that collection. This is a sideboard, which was made between 1900 and 1911 by Ernest Stowe. He used white birch bark and yellow birch rounds to embellish his piece in a rather high style fashion, but using those rustic elements. What's interesting about Ernest Stowe is that he produced this incredible rustic furniture. He lived near Corey's on Indian Carry on the upper Saranac Lake until 1911, went to Florida in 1911 to visit relatives and never returned to the Adirondack Park. He married a woman named Katie Childs from Malone, settled in Malone, and continued to work as a carpenter, but we're not sure that he continued to make furniture. We think he made furniture in Florida as well as the Adirondacks because some pieces have been found down there. But his move to Malone seems to have ended his interest in building materials like that. So we're very pleased that we have a small collection of Stowe's work, and we're really excited to pull this out on exhibit for you to see in July. So next slide, please. So birch bark, the white birch is sort of iconic in I know I use that word a lot, it's sort of iconic in Adirondack forests, very popular with rustic furniture makers, but also something that has inspired artists working in other media as well. This is a piece by an artist named Kathleen Spain. It is one of a series of tree pots made of ceramic. It is actually designed as a teapot with a lid and a spout. But each of the 4 pieces in this tree pot series look like birch trees, inspired by the Adirondacks. And it's very interesting because she's really, really interested in the life cycle of birch trees. She says she began this by imagining the manner of growth of the tree. Important also are the destructive elements, insect, human, and fungal, that are ever present in their habitat. So as you look at her pieces, you'll see bits of fungus growing, really realistic, wonderfully tactile. This is one of the disadvantages of having an art collection, is that you can't touch these things when you really want to, but it's just beautifully done. You would not know that it was made of ceramic. So we will have 2 of her pots on exhibit in Artists and Inspiration in the Wild in July. Next slide, please. So the wood of the Adirondacks is not just inspiring for the way it looks, but for the fact that it is a wonderful material to work with. And we have some really amazing examples of woodworking coming in this exhibit. And this is one of them. This is a violin that was made by Orville Moses Robinson in 1890. Robinson was a young widower when he came to the Adirondacks from Vermont in 1864. He was also a gunsmith, and he established a partnership with gunmaker Dan Wilkinson, and they created the Adirondack Arms Company. In 1870 and 1872, Robinson secured patents for repeating rifle mechanisms, which caught the attention of the Winchester Arms Company, which subsequently bought him out. And at that point, he turned from making guns to making musical instruments. In doing this exhibit, one of the things that we've done is that we've contacted a number of artists to give their views of other people's work. And so we asked Glenn Hill Jr., who is himself a talented instrument maker, to give us his impressions of this violin. And it's just a wonderful, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he said, from the gorgeous flame maple back and sides to the well-played spruce top and ebony tailpiece, I can appreciate the quality tone woods and fine craftsmanship in such a small package. Next slide, please. So Glenn Hill Jr. should know what he's talking about, because he is himself an incredible, talented maker of musical instruments. This is one of his guitars, which we purchased for this exhibit. If you've been to our Indian art fairs, you may have seen him and his work. They are absolutely gorgeous. You just, again, you want to touch it. I'm sorry we can't let you do that, but they're just so beautifully crafted. He makes these incredible hollow body guitars. This one in particular, he made during the COVID-19 pandemic. And while the world shut down, he is a member of the Mohawk Nation and decided to spend some of his time learning more about his Mohawk heritage. And this guitar reflects the things that he learned and absorbed during that time period. There's a flame maple inlay of an ostawa, a rattle, sky dome inlays, and the back of the guitar features traditional Mohawk tattoo patterns. It's truly a beautiful object. And one of the things that was sort of important to Glenn as an artist was that even though artwork reflects the personality, worldview, and cultural background that they come from, he didn't want to be pigeonholed. He says Native artists often find themselves sort of shoved into this particular niche. And so he writes, as a child, I could draw. Then as a teenager, I began painting. but the call of music kept pulling me, particularly guitar music. I found that even before finishing high school, society already had me pigeonholed as a Native American artist. Then again, as a musician, I would also be labeled as Native American music. I didn't want to paint horses and buffalo, nor did I want to play minor key flute music. Yes, I'm Native, Gani and Kahaka, and I happen to be an artist and musician. And he does amazing work. Next slide, please. So one of the traditions that we are also including in this exhibit, I think, is something that people do traditionally associate with Indigenous cultures, and that is basket making. This particular basket is a work basket made about 1930 by an unknown maker for the St. Regis Indian Trading Company. This was owned and operated by a non-native businessman who paid his Mohawk artists very little, and then sold their work wholesale to retail operations that would cater to tourists and other types of buyers. The St. Regis catalogs, some of which we have in the collection, featured photographs of the Akwesasne Mohawk making and displaying their work, which sort of underscored to potential buyers that they were in fact getting real Indian baskets. And in 1932, the company owner, Archibald McKinnon, was reported to have under his supervision the work of 2,500 Indians who are located on the St. Regis Reservation. The business has developed to such an extent that its products are sold throughout the United States, and Mr. McKinnon employs 5 traveling representatives. So the business and Mr. McKinnon prospered, although his basket makers did not. Next slide, please. So this is a page from one of the catalogs that shows a very similar knitting basket. These things would have been very popular with Victorian ladies. Containers were very popular with the Victorians, and certainly a work basket for your knitting would have been a very useful object. Next slide, please. So basket making and this long tradition is something that is still held very dear by the Mohawk community. It is an important part of their traditions, and it is one of their traditions that is passed down from one generation to the next. And like all artists, current events, political situations, things that affect their community are all grist for the mill for creative output. And in this case, artist Carrie Hill has taken the iconic object of the COVID pandemic, the face mask, and rendered it in traditional Mohawk basket weaving technique. This is called #COVIDCreation2020. At the beginning of that year, I don't think any of us could have anticipated the changes it would have, the COVID pandemic would wreak on all of us. And so artists have responded in various ways. This one in particular, she says, is made of black ash splint, sweetgrass, and love, a symbol of healing. Carrie Hill is a master basket maker. She was a teacher for many years and then took a leap of faith and decided to establish her own basket making business. And she said it was pretty scary to leave that steady paycheck, she said, but it's cool because even if I don't eat steak every night, there's still bologna. And if I can't afford bologna, there's always peanut butter and jelly. It's just wild that this is my life, but I'm grateful every day. So she collects the materials she needs once a year. She collects sweetgrass and black ash, year's supply at a time. And she says this is a way of learning about the cycles of nature and the right way to live in balance with the land by the careful gathering of materials. Next slide, please. So I want to wrap up with 2 of my very favorite paintings and what I think is really nice about the pairing is that they really show sort of the continuum of artistic interest in the landscape, a continuum of some of artistic traditions in landscape painting. But they're definitely done by two very distinct artists. This first one is called Near Saranac Lake, Adirondacks, from 1874 by Levi Wells Prentice. So this is a very early view of the area around Saranac Lake, the village. You can see this is before it was really populated as a population center. And in 1827, a man named Pliny Miller built a dam on the Saranac River here, which created a body of water called Mill Pond. It was where loggers would float some of the logs that they had cut in the surrounding forests and corralled them before sending them off to their final destination. So Prentice was standing near Mill Pond, looking northeast toward Mackenzie Mountain, which you see rising there on the right. But again, you have all the elements, the sky, the atmosphere, the reflection in the water. Just a really, really beautiful composition. Next slide, please. So this is also a fairly recent acquisition for us, and one that I really love. This is called Dock. It was painted in 2017 by an artist named Joe Remillard. And this is a view of Silver Lake looking toward a popular campground, which you can see in the distance. But again, that still and glassy water that reflects the morning summer sky, distant mountains, a dock in the foreground, that sort of iconic Adirondack image. Something that you saw in Stoddard, something you would see in Levi Wells Prentice's work as well, but done in his own unique style. And what I think is really wonderful too is that he's able to articulate where some of these images come for him. He says, "This is the view of Silver Lake Mountain that my children grew up seeing every summer morning. It is the same view that their parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents saw as well. The never-changing beauty of this place makes it sacred and reassuring. I paint the people and places in my life that I love." And I think that's a beautiful way to end our sneak peek at some of the things that you'll be able to see in this year's new exhibit. So please come. It's one thing to see them on the screen, but all of these things are so much more beautiful and wonderful in person, which is really how they're meant to be seen. So thank you.
Laura, that was so wonderful. I've enjoyed going on this journey with you this evening and for the last several years. One thing I wanted to ask you to speak to is you showed some knitting baskets. You showed obviously musical instruments. If you can speak a little bit to that sense of utilitarian objects that we have, as well as Tait's and Prentice and some of those, more characteristic fine art pieces.
So why are we not making a distinction? Is that
why are we not making a distinction?
So we chose to cast a very broad net with this, and this distinction between art and artisanal work is very much a Western notion. I think there's a tremendous amount of artistry that happens with makers who are working within a set of restrictions, or like a guide boat builder. You need to build a boat to certain specifications so that it will float well, that it will carry a certain amount of weight, that it's lightweight, that you can pick it up and carry it. But they're also incredibly beautiful to look at. And I think when you look at the basketry and the ceramics, whether it's an actual teapot or an art piece, all of those things are inspired by the Adirondacks, by the natural environment in the Adirondacks, whether they're intended to be functional or simply purely aesthetic. I think there's much more of a blurred line there than we sometimes think. That's my personal opinion.
Well, we do have a question that connects to that. the ADKX collection is both terrific and extensive, as we all who work with it every day are well aware. Thank you for that compliment. How did you think through what pieces to feature in the new Artist and Inspiration exhibition?
It was sometimes tougher than, we we are taking over an entire building that basically contains 3 galleries, and yet when we start placing objects, that space seemed to shrink considerably. So we didn't have as much space as we would have liked, but we wanted to make sure that we had a variety of different types of media. So everything from hand-carved miniatures, ceramics, textile work, fine art paintings, a little bit of the written word and the embellishments that went with it. We also wanted to cover a wide variety of artists, people from different backgrounds, different time periods, maybe different parts of the park, so that we could really show the true variety that exists in that collection. So that's kind of the big answer. But as I said, the lucky part of all of this is that we have plenty of room to play around in future years. There are some things that will have to come off exhibit for a while, the light sensitive material, the works on paper, textiles. So we know that we have to rotate those things, but we have opportunities also to bring other types of new art into this exhibit as well.
And one thing that I've really appreciated is also the fact that there's something for everybody. You have winter carnival buttons that have a real joyfulness and playfulness and will be hits to people who perhaps aren't necessarily art museum enthusiasts to, again, fine art. There's things that, crafts people might be able to appreciate. So there's a really diverse collection, and I'm glad you were able to share a lot of it with everybody tonight. So we have another question. Speaking of furniture, do we have any safes, if that's the correct word, kitchen and dining furniture with locks, or was that strictly a Southern phenomenon?
That's an interesting question. We do have a pie safe, I believe, in the collection. It's part of the rustic, the rustic furniture. But they were perhaps not as prevalent here as they were in the South. Don't know.
I know I would steal a pie if I could, so.
Well, there you go.
How did you locate the manuscript and drawings of the gentleman who sketched and painted his neighborhood?
Much of what we have in the collection, we do have some purchasing power. We have some funds that are specifically designated to acquire art and artifacts. But much of what we have was donated to us. And if I remember correctly, that was one of the things that came to us, I believe, from one of his family members.
And we have another question about provenance. The Struthers manuscript, how did the museum get a hold of that one?
That I don't actually remember. It may have been a purchase. I don't remember. I'm sorry.
Are you familiar with the work of Jean S. Wilson from Blue Mountain Lake? She's a watercolorist.
And we do have a few pieces by her, and she may be making appearances in future iterations of this exhibit.
And I do want to remind everybody, if you've got more questions, we've got a little bit more time to take one or two more questions if anybody would like to send one in. So somebody asks about our collection in more general terms. We've got a lot of maple syrup making collection, which is, relates to where we are the calendar right now. But do we have anything on beekeeping in our collection as well?
We do, actually. We have quite a bit. It's interesting, as the forest started to go away for grazing areas for horses and oxen, the bees came in, and beekeeping became quite popular. Farmers would sell the honey or exchange the honey for other goods that they needed. And as roads were paved and gasoline automobiles came into play, the forest came back into those pastures, which were no longer needed to feed draft animals. And the bears came back. So it's actually quite difficult to raise bees in the Adirondacks because the bears will find the hives and they do like honey. But we do have beekeeping equipment and a beekeeper's suit in the collection.
And we've got, I'll take this one last question. I actually know the answer to it, but I think that there's a lot more to the story here. Is Sandra Hildreth represented in the collection? And I think for those who are fans of Sandra, we've got a lot that is coming. Go ahead and speak to the collection issue, but we've got some other opportunities to have her involved this year.
So we have a painting by Sandra Hildreth, which is on exhibit in Boats and Boating, I believe. But we also just acquired a really wonderful painting. It's just beautiful. And actually it's of early spring with ice going out with a view of the mountains in the background. And that will be going in the exhibit either next year or the year after that. So you have to stay tuned, but it is a gorgeous painting. It will be showing up in our collections database if it's not already there.
I think that that's a really exciting point that you've just made, and you made it a few times, is the fact that it's a living exhibition, even though we call it permanent. Every year you'll come back and you'll see something new. We've got some real surprises in store in the next couple of years, but it's something that's always going to be changing. It's a very active space, and we certainly hope that all of you come and see it this season. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and thank you to Laura. Just a reminder that this program, it has been recorded and it'll be available on the museum's website later this week. Our next program in this series, and as I said, our last one will be May 15th, where we will be coming to you live from the galleries. The registration information for that program will be popping up in the chat. With summer truly not all that far off, we encourage you all to come and become a member at ADKX if you aren't already part of our family. This series, all of our Zoom series, continues to be free for all, but as a member, you benefit from many exclusive ADKX perks, including free admission for the entire season and an invitation to see Artists in Inspiration before it opens to the general public. And finally, we can't do any of these programs without the generosity of our donors. Please consider supporting the museum. We wish all of you a wonderful spring evening, and thank you, Laura, ever so much. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.
Good night.